and how that somatosensory system is wired in with and communicating with our autonomic nervous system that regulates our levels of alertness or calmness. After that, I'm going to talk about how the acupuncture that's being done right now also points to relief for what's called referred pain. So this takes us all back to the homunculus. Let's start there. We have this representation of our body surface in our brain. That representation is what we call somatotopic. And what somatotopy is it just means that areas of your body that are near one another, so your thumb and your forefinger, for instance, are represented by neurons that are nearby each other in the brain. Now you might say, well, duh, but actually it didn't have to be that way. The neurons that represent the tip of my forefinger and the neurons that represent my thumb on the same hand could have been distantly located. And therefore, the map of my body surface, the homunculus, would be really disordered. But it's not that way. It's very ordered. It's very smooth. As, let's say you were to image my brain, if you were to stimulate my finger, my forefinger, and then march that stimulation across my finger, across the palm, and to the nearby thumb, you would see that neurons in the brain would also make a sort of J shape in their pattern of activation. So that means they're so-called somatotopy. But the connections from those brain neurons are sent into the body, and they are synchronized with, meaning they cross-wire with and form synapses with some of the input from the viscera, from our guts, from our diaphragm, from our stomach, from our spleen, from our heart. Our internal organs are sending information up to this map in our brain of the body surface, but it's about internal information, what we call interoception, our ability to look inside or imagine inside and feel what we're feeling inside. So the way to think about this accurately is that our representation of ourself is a representation of our internal workings, our viscera, our guts, everything inside our skin, and the surface of our skin, and the external world, what we're seeing. Those three things are always being combined in a very interesting, complex, but very seamless way. Acupuncture involves taking needles and sometimes electricity and or heat as well, and stimulating particular locations on the body. And through these maps of stimulation that have been developed over thousands of years, mostly in Asia, but now this is a practice that's being done many places throughout the world. They have these maps that speak to, oh, well, if you stimulate this part of the body, you get this response. And if somebody has a gastrointestinal issue, like their guts are moving too quick, they have diarrhea, you stimulate this area and it'll slow their gut motility down. Or if their gut motility is too slow, they're constipated, you stimulate someplace else and it accelerates it. And, hearing about this stuff, it sounds kind of, to a Westerner who's not thinking about the underlying neural circuitry, it could sound kind of wacky. It really sounds like alternative or even kind of, really out there kind of stuff. But when you look at the neural circuitry, the neuroanatomy, it really starts to make sense. And Chufu Ma's lab at Harvard Medical School is an excellent laboratory, has been exploring how stimulation of different types, intense or weak, with heat or without heat, on different parts of the body can modulate pain and inflammation. And what they've shown in a particularly exciting study is that stimulation of the abdomen anywhere in the midsection weekly does nothing. And that's not very interesting, you might say. Intense stimulation of the abdomen, however, with this electroacupuncture, has a very strong effect of increasing inflammation in the body. And this is important to understand because it's not just that stimulating the gut does this because you're activating the gut area. It activates a particular nerve pathway. For the aficionados, it's the splenic spinal sympathetic axis, if you really want to know, and it's pro-inflammatory under most conditions. However, there are other conditions where if, for instance, the person is dealing with a particular bacterial infection, that can be beneficial. And this goes back to a much earlier discussion that we had on a previous podcast and that we'll revisit again and again, which is that the stress response was designed to combat infection. So it turns out that there are certain patterns of stimulation on the abdomen that can actually liberate immune cells from our immune organs like our spleen and counter infection through the release of things like adrenaline. Chufu's lab also showed that stimulation of the feet and hands can reduce inflammation. And again, this was done mechanistically. This was done by blocking certain pathways with the appropriate control experiments. This was done not in any kind of subjective way. This was also done by measuring particular molecules, IL-6 and cytokines and things that are related to the inflammation response. And what they showed is that the stimulation of in particular the hind limbs at low intensity led to increases in the activity of this vagal pathway, the vagus nerve being this 10th cranial nerve that serves the kind of rest and digest and parasympathetic, in other words, calming response. So what this means is that we are now at the front edge of this research field that's just, it's early days still, but it's discovering that depending on whether or not the stimulation is intense or mild, and depending on where the stimulation is done on the body, you can get very different effects. So this points to the idea that you can't say acupuncture good or acupuncture bad. There has to be a systematic understanding of what exactly the effect is that you're trying to achieve. And the underlying basis for this is really relevant to the thing about adrenaline that I said before, that in a fight, it's rare that you ever feel pain when you get hit. I've experienced that, but later it hurts a lot. It turns out that when you stimulate these pathways that activate in particular the adrenals, the adrenal gland liberates norepinephrine and epinephrine, and the brain does as well, it binds to what are called the beta noradrenergic receptors. Okay, so this is really getting kind of down into the weeds, but the beta noradrenergic receptors activate the spleen, which liberates cells that combat infection, and it's anti-inflammatory. That's the short-term quick response. The more intense stimulation of the abdomen and other areas can be pro-inflammatory because of the ways that they trigger certain loops that go back to the brain and trigger the sort of anxiety pathways, and that place people into a state of anxiety that exacerbates pain. So one pathway stimulates norepinephrine and blunts pain, the other one doesn't. What does all this mean? How are we supposed to put all of this together? Well, there's a paper that was published in Nature Medicine in 2014. This is an excellent journal that describes how dopamine can activate the vagus peripherally, not dopamine in the brain, peripherally, and norepinephrine can activate the vagus peripherally and reduce inflammation. And I'm not trying to throw a ton of facts at you and say, well, what am I supposed to do with all this information? What this means is that there are real maps of our body surface that, when stimulated, communicate with our autonomic nervous system, the system that controls alertness or calmness, and thereby releases either molecules like norepinephrine and dopamine, which make us more alert as we would be in a fight, and blunt our response to pain. And they reduce inflammation. But there are yet other pathways that, when stimulated, are pro-inflammatory. And that brings us to the question of, what is all this inflammation stuff that people are talking about? One of the things that bothers me so much these days, and I'm not easily irritated, but what really bothers me is when people are talking about inflammation like inflammation is bad. Inflammation is terrific. Inflammation is the reason why cells are called to the site of injury to clear it out. Inflammation is what's going to allow you to heal from any injury. Chronic inflammation is bad, but acute inflammation is absolutely essential. Remember those kids that we talked about earlier that have mutations in these receptors that for sensing pain, they never get inflammation. And that's why their joints literally disintegrate. It's really horrible because they don't actually have the inflammation response because it was never triggered by the pain response. So inflammation can be very beneficial. There's a lot of interest nowadays in taking things and doing things to limit inflammation. One of the ones that comes up a lot is turmeric. I'm sure the moment anyone starts talking about inflammation, the question is, what about turmeric? I have talked before about turmeric elsewhere. I am very skeptical of turmeric, and I might lose a few friends, although that'd be weird if that would say something about my friendships if I lost friends over a discussion about turmeric. But in any case, turmeric does have anti-inflammatory properties. There's no question about that. But as we've just described, inflammation can be a very good thing, at least in the short term. The other thing about turmeric is there was a study published out of Stanford in collection with some work from other universities showing that a lot of turmeric is heavily contaminated with lead. The lead is used to get that really rich, dense, orange coloring to it that everyone wants to see. So you have to check your sources of turmeric. The other thing is, for men in particular, Turmeric can be very antagonistic to dihydrotestosterone. Dihydrotestosterone is the more dominant form of androgen in human males, and it's involved in things like aggression and libido and things of that sort. Many people that I've talked to who have taken turmeric get a severe blunting of affect and libido. So for some people, that might be a serious negative. I certainly avoid turmeric. I don't like turmeric for that reason. I also think that the inflammation response is a healthy response. You have to keep it in check, and we're going to talk about specific practices for wound healing and injury in a moment. But this idea that just inflammation is bad and you want to reduce inflammation across the board, nothing could be further from the truth. We have pathways that exist in our body specifically to increase inflammation. It's the inflammation that goes unchecked, just like stress, which is problematic for repair from brain injury and that can exacerbate certain forms of dementia, et cetera. But I'd like to create a little bit more nuance, or a lot more nuance if possible, in the conversation around inflammation, because people have just taken this discussion around inflammation to be this idea that just inflammation is bad, and nothing could be further from the truth. Before I continue, I just thought I'd answer a question that I get a lot, which is, what about Wim Hof breathing? I get asked about this a lot. Wim Hof, also called aka the Iceman, has this breathing that's similar to Tumo breathing, as it was originally called. Involves basically hyperventilating and then doing some exhales and some breath holds. A couple things about that: it should never be done near water. People who have done it near water, unfortunately, have drowned. It's certainly not for everybody, and I'm not here to either promote it nor discourage people from doing it. But I think we should ask ourselves, what is the net effect of that? Because a number of people have asked me about it in relation to pain management. The effect of doing that kind of breathing, it's not a mysterious effect. It liberates adrenaline from the adrenals. There is a paper published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, which is a very fine journal, showing that breathing pattern can counter infection from endotoxin. And that's because when you have adrenaline in your system and when the spleen is very active, that response is used to counter infection, and stress counters infection. Talk about this more going forward, but the idea that stress lends itself to infection is false. Stress counters infection by liberating killer cells in the body. You don't want the stress response to stay on indefinitely, however. Things like Wim Hof breathing, like ice baths, anything that releases adrenaline will counter the infection. But you want to regulate the duration of that adrenaline response. This should make perfect sense. We, as a species, had to evolve under conditions of famine and cold. Actually, Texas right now is an extreme case of cold and power outages. I've seen the pictures, and there are a lot of people out there who are really suffering. Their systems are releasing a ton of adrenaline. They're cold. Some of them are likely to be hungry. They're probably stressed. They're releasing a lot of adrenaline, which is keeping them safe from infection. After they get their heat back on and they relax and they can finally warm up again, which we would like for them very soon, hopefully by the time this podcast comes out, that will have already happened. That's typically when people get sick, because the immune response is blunted as the stress response starts to subside. So stress, inflammation, countering infection that comes from endotoxin, that comes from any number of things, can be from cold, it can be from hyperventilation, it can be from a physical threat, it can be from the stress of an exam or an upcoming surgery. This adrenaline thing and the inflammation associated with it is adaptive. It's highly adaptive. It is a short-term plasticity that is designed to make us better for what we're experiencing and challenged with, not worse. And so hopefully that will add an additional layer to this whole idea that, stress is bad, inflammation is bad, et cetera. Again, I'm not suggesting people do or don't do something like Wim Hof Tumo breathing. I just want to point to the utility. It's very similar to the utility from cold showers, ice baths, and other forms of anything that increase adrenaline. Every episode, I want to make sure that every listener comes away with as much knowledge as possible, but also actionable tools. And today we've talked about a variety of tools, but I want to center in on a particular sequence of tools that hopefully you won't need, but presumably if you're a human being and you're active, you will need at some point. It's about managing injury and recovering and healing fast, or at least as fast as possible. It includes removing the pain. It includes getting mobility back and getting back to a normal life. whatever that means for you. I want to emphasize that what I'm about to talk about next was developed in close consultation with Kelly Starrett, who many of you probably have heard of before. Kelly can be found at The Ready State. He's a formally trained, so degreed and educated exercise physiologist. He's a world expert in movement and tissue rehabilitation, etc. They're not sponsors of the podcast. Kelly is a friend and a colleague. He's somebody that I personally trust, and his views on tissue rehabilitation and injury, I think, are really grounded extremely well in both medicine, physiology, and the real cutting edge of what's new and what you might not get in terms of advice from the typical person. All that said, you always should consult with your physician before adopting any protocols or removing any protocols. So I asked Kelly, I made it really simple. I said, okay, let's say I were to sprain my ankle or break my arm or injure my knee or ACL tear or something like that, or shoulder injury. What are the absolute necessary things to do regardless of situation? And what science is this grounded in? And then I made it a point to go find the studies that either supported or refuted what he was telling me, because that's why I'm here. So the first one is a very basic one that now you have a lot of information to act on, which is in terms of what we know about tissue rehabilitation, both brain and body, we know that sleep is essential. And so we both agreed that 8 hours minimum in bed per night is critical. Now, what was interesting, however, is that it doesn't have to be 8 hours of sleep. We acknowledge that some of that time might be challenging to get to sleep, especially if one is in pain or mobility is limited. You know, we forget how often we roll over in bed, or how the conditions of our sleeping can impact those injuries too. So Kelly acknowledged, and I agree, that 8 hours of sleep would be ideal, but if not, at least 8 hours immobile. And that speaks to the power of these non-sleep deep rest protocols too. If you can't sleep, doing non-sleep deep rest protocols, we've provided links to them before. We're going to continue to provide links to the previous ones, and new ones are coming soon. That is extremely beneficial. So that's a non-negotiable in terms of getting the foundation for allowing for lymphatic clearance and tissue clearance, etc. The other is, if possible, unless it's absolutely excruciating or you just can't do it, a 10-minute walk per day. Of course, you don't want to exacerbate the injury. At least a 10-minute walk per day, and probably longer. This is where it gets interesting. I learned that when you injure yourself, you're supposed to ice something. You're supposed to put ice on it. But I didn't realize this, but when speaking to exercise physiologists and some physicians, they said that the ice is really more of a placebo. It numbs the environment of the injury, which is not surprising, and will eliminate the pain for a short while. But it has some negative effects that perhaps offset its use. One, it sludges. It creates sludging within the blood and other lymphatic tissue. So it actually can create some like clotting and sludging of the tissue and fluids, the fascial interface with muscle, and a number of the stuff that's supposed to be flowing through there can slow up and increase inflammation in the wrong way. It can actually restrict movement out of the injury site, which is bad because you want the macrophages and the other cell types phagocytosing, eating up the debris and injury and moving it out of there so that it can repair. So that was surprising to me, which made me ask, well, then what about heat? Well, it turns out heat is actually quite beneficial. A lot of people talk about heat shock proteins and all these genetic pathways and protein pathways that can be activated by heat. Very little data to support the idea that heat shock proteins are part of the wound healing process, at least in terms of the sorts of conventional heat that one could use, like a hot water bottle or a hot bath or a hot compress. The major effects seem to be explained by heat improving the viscosity of the tissues and the clearance and the perfusion of fluid, blood, lymph, and other fluids out of the injury area. So that's really interesting. I didn't know this. I thought, well, you're supposed to ice something. I said, well, whenever I would see a kid get injured in soccer, never me, of course. No, of course, I got injured in soccer from time to time. They give you an ice pack. And the ice pack removes some of the pain. I think the consensus now, which was surprising to me, is that the ice pack is actually more of the top-down modulation. You think you're doing something for the pain. And there's some interesting studies that actually show the placebo effect of the ice pack. So ice packs are placebo, perhaps. That's interesting. I'll underline perhaps, because who knows? Maybe there's some people out there that are going to say this is totally crazy, and the ice is actually very beneficial. But it seems like heat, mobility, sleep, keeping movement, and it turns out that the movement itself can act as a bit of an analgesic. It can actually reduce the pain, whereas the ice reduces the pain but sludges the tissue and keeps the cells that need to be removed from leaving the area. Now, what's also interesting is in neuroscience, we know that if we want to kill neurons or silence neurons, we cool them. This is a well-known tool in the laboratory. Some of the early and most important studies in neuroscience that form the basis for the textbooks were lowering a cooling probe into a particular area of the brain or a peripheral nerve in order to shut down that nerve. So the cooling will shut down the nerve. But another very well-known fact in neuroscience textbooks is that when the activity of the nerve pathway or neurons comes back, there's what's called homeostatic plasticity, that it rebounds with greater pain, with a higher level of intensity, which in the pain system would equate to greater pain. So regardless of where these neurons are in the body, if you stimulate a neuron, it's active. If you cool it, it becomes inactive. And when the neuron heats back up after being cooled, it becomes hyperactive. And so this makes really good sense as to why heat, provided it's not damaging levels of heat, would be more beneficial for wound healing and for reducing pain in the short and long run than would be cold or ice, which I find very interesting. Now, in terms of chronic pain, the manuscripts on this, my discussion with Kelly and with others, point to the fact that chronic pain is basically plasticity gone wrong. It's sort of like PTSD for the emotional system and the stress system. And chronic pain is going to involve a number of different protocols to rewire both the brain centers and the peripheral centers associated with chronic pain. Certain things like fibromyalgia, for instance, which is whole body pain, relate to too little inhibition in the brain. You have excitation and inhibition. They come from different sources of neurons. The inhibition is mainly from GABA and glycine and things like that. In fibromyalgia, there's too little central within the brain modulation of the pain responses so that people experience whole body pain. So in that case, the emerging therapies are really interesting. I have a friend who works for the National Institutes of Health who unfortunately suffers from fibromyalgia, who asked me about this a lot. And his question, and what he's now actually exploring, is red light therapy, something that I've talked about on various Instagram posts. Red light therapy typically is talked about in terms of mitochondria, and the data on that are not so terrific, at least not really published in blue ribbon journals in most cases, except for one study that I'm aware of from Glenn Jeffrey's lab at University College London, showing that red light stimulation to the eyes in people 40 or older can offset some of the effects of macular degeneration by improving the health of the photoreceptors. People with fibromyalgia, which is this whole body pain, are now starting to use red light therapies. Now, I asked Kelly and others and some experts in pain, what are your thoughts on this red light therapy for things like fibromyalgia and pain, especially red light local therapy? Their idea, and I don't think this is a field that's progressed far enough now to really place any firm conclusions on, but the idea is that red light therapy locally may have some effect, but the systemic red light therapy, this is like wearing protection to the eyes in some cases, so not for the treatment of macular degeneration, but wearing protection to the eyes and getting very bright light, red light therapy, in many ways may be, to use Kelly's words, approximating the effects of nature. These are like surrogate technologies for getting outside in the sunshine. When you're in the sun, it might not look red, but there are a lot of red wavelengths coming toward you. So the red light therapies may have some utility, but getting into sunlight may actually have as much or more effect. Of course, if these wounds are on a part of the body that you can't expose, then you could imagine why the red light therapy might be good. I don't know, depending on the neighborhood you live in, that may or may not be a weird thing to go outside and expose your body to sunlight. Probably a number of factors that dictate whether or not that would be weird or not, but that's up to you, not me. And it seems that, so movement, heat, not ice, light, sleep, and in some cases, the use, and I'll talk about this in a moment, some cases the use of restricting above and below the injury to then release and then increase perfusion through the site. So may actually accelerate the wound healing. So all of this might sound just like common sense knowledge, but to me, at least as a 45-year-old, I always just thought it's ice, it's non-steroid anti-inflammatory drugs, it's things that block prostaglandins. So things like aspirin, ibuprofen, acetaminophen, those things generally work by blocking things like they're called the COX prostaglandin blockers and things of that sort, things in that pathway. Those sorts of treatments which reduce inflammation may not be so great at the beginning when you want inflammation. They may be important for limiting pain so people can be functional at all. But the things that I talked about today really are anchored in three principles. One is that the inflammation response is a good one. This is what we're learning from Chufu Ma's lab's work on acupuncture. The immediate acute inflammation response is good. It calls to the site of injury things that are going to clean up the injury and bad cells. Then there are going to be things that are going to improve perfusion, like the lymphatic system, getting deep sleep, feet elevated, sleeping on one side, low-level zone 2 cardio 3 times a week. Red light perhaps is going to be useful, although sunlight might be just as good, depending on who you talk to. And we talk about that probably more at length in a future episode. A number of people will ask me, I'm sure, about stem cells, and I don't want to take more of your time by going into an hour-long discussion about stem cells. Stem cells exist in all of us during development. We were created from stem cells, which are cells that can become essentially anything. Later, cells get what's called restricted in their lineage. So a skin cell, unless you do some fancy molecular gymnastics to it, you can't actually turn that cell into a neuron. Yamanaka won the Nobel Prize for finding these Yamanaka factors, which you could give a skin cell to turn it into a neuron. But that's not an approved therapy at this time. But many people ask me about platelet-rich plasma, so-called PRP. They take blood, they enrich for platelets, and then they re-inject it back into people. Here's the deal. This deserves an entire episode. It has never been shown whether or not the injection itself is what's actually creating the effect. This is something that the acupuncture literature suffered from for a long time, that the sham control, as it's called, sham, we don't mean it's a sham, but in science you say a sham control, meaning you do everything that exactly the same way you would. Like, so for acupuncture, you would bring the needle right up to the skin, but you wouldn't actually poke it into the skin, for instance. That would be a sham control. With a drug treatment, you would inject a drug into a person, and then the sham control would be that you would bring the injection over. You might do the injection or not do the injection because you imagine that the injection itself could have an effect. It's never really been shown whether or not PRP has effects that are separate from injecting a volume of fluid into a tissue. The claims that PRP actually contains stem cells are very, very feeble. And when you look at the literature and you talk to anyone expert in the stem cell field, they will tell you that the number of stem cells in PRP is infinitesimally small. In fact, so much so that these places that inject PRP for injuries are not allowed to advertise through the use of the words stem cells. It's actually illegal at this point. At least as far as I know, it was through the end of last year, and I'm guessing it still is now. Stem cells are an exciting area of technology. However, there's a clinic down in Florida that was shut down a couple years ago for injecting stem cells harvested from patients into the eye for macular degeneration. These were people that were suffering from poor vision, and very shortly after injecting these stem cells into the eyes, they went completely blind. So I'm somebody who is very skeptical of the stem cell treatment work that's out there. It's actually very hard to get in the United States for this reason. It's not approved. The PRP treatments are very complicated. The marketing around them is shaky at best. I'm sure a number of people will say that they had PRP and benefited from it tremendously, and I don't doubt that. Whether or not it was placebo, today we talked a lot about top-down control. That's just a variant on the word placebo, belief effects. Whether or not it was placebo or not, I don't know. I wasn't there. That's for you to decide. And I'm not here to tell you that you should or shouldn't do something, but I do think that anything involving stem cells, one should be very cautious of. You should also be very cautious of anyone that tells you that PRP is injecting a lot of stem cells. This is an evolving area that really needs a lot more work and attention. The major issue with stem cells that I think is concerning is that stem cells are cells that want to become lots of different things, not just the tissue that you're interested in. So if you damage your knee and you inject stem cells into your knee, you need to molecularly restrict those stem cells so that they don't become tumor cells, right? A tumor is a collection of stem cells, right? So when you get something horrible like glioblastoma in the brain, which is a terrible thing to have, it's glial cells that returned to stemness, excessive stemness. They've started to produce too many of themselves. And glioblastoma is often deadly, not always. So injecting stem cells, it sounds great, and it sounds like something that one would want to do, but one needs to approach this with extreme caution, even if it's your own blood or stem cells that you're re-injecting. I think those technologies are coming. They're on the way. If any of you are devotees of PRP, tell me your experiences with them. I'm curious. I want to see the papers. I want to know the evidence. And of course, there are always folks out there that say, I don't care what the scientists and the physicians and the FDA say. I just want to do this. And if that's your stance, that's your stance. I'm not here to govern that. But I do think that people should be informed. And in thinking about tissue recovery and injury, that's what I was able to glean. Again, check out what Kelly and his coworkers are doing at the Ready State. It's phenomenal, and they've worked with all the top people in just about every domain of life. It seems very high integrity folks. Some of you are probably saying, "Well, I'm not injured. I'm not an athlete. I don't want stem cell injections. I don't have." Again, I think you shouldn't get stem cell injections for now. Please hold off until the field learns more about how to do that safely. But I want to talk about and end with a really interesting and somewhat weird technology, which is baby blood. I have a colleague at Stanford. His name is Tony Weiss-Corey. And in 2014, his laboratory published a study showing that the blood of young rodents, mice and rats, when transfused into old, demented rodents, mice and rats, made those old, demented rodents recover much of their memory and seem much more vital and energetic, better recall of different spatial learning tasks, tissue and wound healing, they've since shown can be improved in these older animals. It's pretty incredible. They went on to show several years later that blood from umbilical cords, I'm not making this up, blood from umbilical cords can do the same. And this is the basis of a biotech company. Actually, one of my former postdocs is now an employee there. They've isolated the molecules from young blood that seems to vitalize or revitalize the old brain and body. And one of those molecules goes by the name TIMP2, TIMP2. Where's all this going? Well, I don't know how long it's going to be before there are treatments based on these blood transfusions. I doubt that blood transfusions themselves from young people into old people is going to be used for the treatment of dementia, although it might. As weird as it seems, we know that transfusions of all sorts of stuff, for instance, fecal transplants, are being used to treat obesity. The gut microbiome of thin people is being not transfused, but is being transplanted into the colons and guts of obese people and leading to weight loss, which sounds really wild and is not a topic I particularly enjoy talking about. But nonetheless, it points to the importance of the gut microbiome in regulating things like blood sugar and health as it relates to obesity and diabetes and all sorts of things. So it does appear that there are factors in the blood of young members of a given species that are lost over time in the older members of that species. I am not going to give you a tool on the basis of these findings today. I am not going to tell you to consume any fluid from any other member of your species, our species, for any reason. But I do think that it's important to mention that the science is asking questions such as, what are the factors within the brain that allow the young brain to recover so much better than the older brain from injury, from all sorts of things, events, etc. And what are the factors in the older brain that are limiting? And thinking about identifying which factors are going to allow people to restore cognitive function, physical function, wound healing, and so forth. It's a really exciting area. I mention it not to be sensationalist, but because it's happening and because there's a lot of excitement about it, and because I think it's clear that the young brain and body and blood are very different from the old brain, body, and blood. And the goal of science is to identify and isolate those factors that make that such that people who would otherwise get dementia or perhaps even have dementia will be allowed to recover. Again, not an actionable item at this point, but one to think about, perhaps not too long, but one to think about. So I'm going to close there. I've talked about a lot of tools today. I've talked a lot about somatosensation, about plasticity, about pain, about acupuncture, some of the nuance of acupuncture, inflammation, stress. We even talked a little bit about high-intensity breathing, talked about restricting limb movement to get compensatory regrowth of pathways, or I should say reactivation of pathways that have been injured or damaged. So as always, we take kind of a whirlwind tour through a given topic, lay down some tools as we go. Hopefully the principles that relate to pain and injury, but also neuroplasticity in general, today in the context of the somatosensory system, will be of use to all of you. I don't wish injury on any of you, but I do hope that you'll take this information to mind and that you will think about it if ever you find yourself in a situation where you have to ask, what's the difference between my perception and the actual tissue damage? Is injury and pain, is it the same? Well, no. Do I have some control over my experience of pain? Absolutely. Does all of that involve taking drugs or doing certain therapeutics? No, not necessarily. There's an incredible subjective component. There also is a need sometimes to treat the injury at the level of the pain receptors at the site of the wound. So please take the information, do with it what you will. And in the meantime, thank you so much for your time and attention. Before we go, I just want to remind you to please subscribe to the YouTube channel, Apple and or Spotify. Leave us comments and feedback, a 5-star review on Apple if you think we deserve that. Please check out our sponsors. Check out our Patreon, patreon.com/Andrew Huberman. And as well, if you're interested in the supplements that I take and you want to try any of those, you can go to thorne, thorne.com/u/Huberman, and you'll get 20% off any of the supplements listed there, as well as any others on the Thorne site. Once again, thanks so much for your time and attention today. And as always, thank you for your interest in years of your life on this thing. Maybe 3, but probably 5 years of your life. And you'll get your PhD. And there's always this question, like, do you ditch that project and go for something else? Or do you stay with that project? In other words, what you're saying is you get to put your brick on the wall, but it's a brick. Whereas, there are other projects and you go, whoa, like that's like one wing of the cathedral. And it's a rare instance where that happens. And a lot of it's luck and it doesn't always work out anyway. But, what we're saying here is, how hard people are willing to work is often related to what they feel the potential payoff will be. Mm-hmm. If they can sense the payoff, and by the way, I love the protocols that you offered, the empty frame, the journaling to future self, this notion of time capsuling your present thinking into the future. The aging of self, these are very actionable things. I plan to do them, and I think they're very valuable. But if I understand correctly, you are interested in creating a movement of sorts where many, if not everybody, is thinking this way. Because the other model is, okay, well, the Elons will take care of it for us, and or the system's so broken, like there's nothing I can do. I'm just trying to make ends meet. So how does one create a reward system or a social media platform or how does one join up with other people who are trying to do this?
So the question you're getting at is in a lot of the work that I've read and listened to on this podcast, oftentimes it's about how do we optimize the self? and I mean that in a good way, not in a selfish way. How do we make ourselves better? Right, that's where you have to start. Yeah. I'm advocating for how do we optimize society? How do we optimize civilization? And this is a clear case where, unlike when we think of scale being, make more widgets at a cheaper price, this is really a 1 + 1 + 1 + 1 ad infinity. So if ad infinitum, if we think about, just for example, how many listeners and viewers there are of this podcast, millions, right? And how many people they interact with within their closest sphere, and you go out, right? So right now, your listeners have the potential to live and act Longpathian in this way where they're doing something for a greater, they're thinking about their purpose in the world as nested within the larger purpose of our species to allow for more mass flourishing in the future for generations to come. If you think about your listeners and how they interact and how they model behavior, your potential and their spheres, you're at 30, 40, 50 million people, right? That's a very, very large number. And what we know about social and emotional contagion is that these things are contagious. They are memes. This is Susan Blackmore's work. That's how it scales. It actually is one of those things where you're not going to, just add powder and it all of a sudden will create this optimal future for everyone because only one person does it. Like, we all have a role to play in it. It's like literally what I would want is anyone who's listening or watching this, when they're done doing it, to take a few minutes and think about what kind of futures do I want for myself, for my family, for the generations to come, and what is my role in that great play? What do I have to do? And yes, you need the protocols to kind of bring you back into there, right? For me, it's easy because I wrote the book, I did the show, I can just think long path, I can do it. For others, this is going to be the first time they're thinking about this, or maybe they've been thinking about it for years. Even in their smallest interactions, they start doing it. And this gets into kind of the Santa Fe Institute and complexity theory. This stuff starts to actually reverberate. That's how we do it. We don't need a march for long-termism, right? We don't need bumper stickers.
Thank you. There will be no bumper stickers.
There will be no bumper stickers. There will be no bumper stickers. It's about placing our very essence and our actions within the realm of possibility for the futures that we want and our role in that, and then the purpose. So I don't care if you're a barista, if you're a surfing instructor, if you're a brilliant podcaster, whatever it is that you do it with the intention and recognition that you are modeling a way of being in the world that has ramifications and reverberations beyond this current moment. I mean, you said earlier, well, who knows if anyone will listen to your podcast. What I can tell you with certainty, because I'm sure it's probably already happened, is a large language model, an LLM, what we call AI right now, is already, or it will at some point, ingest the Huberman Lab podcast.
Yeah, we have one. We have a Huberman Lab AI.
There you go.
We haven't advertised it very heavily, but it's there. You can ask me questions. So it's pretty good. It sounds a bit like me. The jokes are dry.
They're dry
and not funny.
I was going to say mostly funny, but I'll give you some more. Yeah. But eventually that will percolate out. So at the speed of things are going 3 or 4 years from now, this very conversation, how we're modeled, what I learned in school, discourse ethics, how we talk to one another, that is teaching these machines how to think and act and who and what we are and how to become the best of or the worst of ourselves. What we put out there, the kind of the public-facing content, is going to become what these machines think of as how they should be, and we're modeling it for them. Mm-hmm. And going back to the higher education example for a second, I think higher education, like many institutions, as AI, what we call that, fully comes online, is going to radically change. And it will be, a Cambridge or an Oxford tutor in everyone's ear. And higher education, this idea that you kind of come together to receive information will start to dissipate from higher education. But what higher education will start to do, and I think we'll need to focus on, is not just the intellectual and the cognitive, but also the psychological and the emotional core of who you are and helping you develop that.
Well, amen to that. There was a former guest on this podcast, or there was a guest on this podcast previously, Dr. Wendy Suzuki's professor at NYU. I think now she's the dean of arts and sciences, I think is the correct title. And, she's trying to brings some of her laboratory's data on the value of even very brief meditations to stress management in college. First, to help students manage the stress that is college and being in your early 20s. But I think there's a larger theme there, which is to try and teach emotional development, to teach self-regulation, because many people don't get that. I mean, or they get it, but then there are big gaps. And I love the way that you're describing this. Basically, it's a lens. If I may, it's a lens into human experience that's very dynamic, and is really in concert with the fact that the human brain has the capacity for this dynamic representation of time. Like focus on, like solve for the now. There will be parts of your day, no doubt today, where you just have to solve for the now. You're not thinking about the greater good, and then the ability to dilate your consciousness in the temporal sense and to solve for things that are more long term. Make these investments towards the future. I wonder though, how can we incentivize people to be good, to do good, and how can we incentivize people to do this on a backdrop of a lot of short-term carrots and short-term horizons? I think you've given us some answers, and they're very powerful ones, such as the aging self-image exercise, journaling into the future, writing to future self, the empty frame exercise, linking up with our ancestors and thinking about where we're at now and where we want to go. Is there anything else that you want to add? Meaning, is there anything that we should all be doing? Should we all be reading more biography? Should we, if I look back through history, it's both dark and light. Is there anything else that you really encourage people to do to be the best version of themselves for this life and the ones that come next?
I've touched on this. We need to examine in ourselves, why is it we do and are the way that we are, right? Do you know why in this country we vote on Tuesday?
I don't have any idea.
So most advanced democracies vote over the weekend or a couple of weekends. In America, we vote on Tuesday because that was the time that was necessary for someone to leave church on Sunday, ride on horseback into the big city, vote on Tuesday, and ride back before market day on Wednesday.
I'm so glad you're going to tell me it's not because then people can still watch Monday Night Football.
No, this is long before Monday Night Football. And so I think why we vote on Tuesday, it's a metaphor for so much of who we are and have become as individuals and as a society. I'm a big fan of cognitive behavioral therapy, of CBT. I think partially because what it does is it has us look at what are those negative stories that we tell ourselves, but then because you can't just say stop doing something, you can't just extinguish a behavior, you have to add and put in a positive story. What I've tried to do with some of our time here today, and what I want people to partially take away, more than partially, to really take away and bring in, is examine the why Tuesdays. What are those stories that you've inherited? Some of them are going to be macro social, like you are defined by the society by what you own, by the badge on your car that says how successful you are. That's a story. It's a story that's been fed to us. There are other stories that are very personal. These are stories that can sometimes be very private and go back generations within a family. And then to understand, some of those stories serve us, some of those stories don't serve us. But after discerning that, we then have to write a new story. We have to write a new story for ourselves. Who am I? Why am I here? Isn't going to be answered by a religion or a God or a book or a podcast or a futurist. It's going to be answered by looking and searching inside of yourself about how it is you got here, what really matters, and where you want to contribute and help move us forward as a species on spaceship Earth. As not as a passenger, but as crew on this vessel, and how we're going to move forward. So the stories have served us well, and they have not served us well. And to move forward, it's okay now to say, I'm going to write these stories that serve me. I'm going to see the future, not as a now, not as this thing that I'm heading towards or that's going to tumble over me, but that I'm going to create. And those stories may be very intra-personal, they may be interpersonal, they may be political, they may be business, they may be what you buy, what you consume, but you have to have agency. You have to instill a sense of hope into your own life and a sense of awe and a sense of really just empathy for who you are and where we are if we want to collectively move forward into the futures that will allow our descendants to look back on us and say, they were great ancestors.
I love it. And I also just want to highlight the importance of record keeping, of putting things down on paper or maybe in electronic form, creating time capsules for the future generations, because I think a lot of what people probably are thinking or worried about a little bit is like, okay, I can do all this stuff to try and make things better and even give up the desire for any kind of credit, but not feeling like it will be of any significance. But what I've learned from you today is that, it starts with the self and then it radiates out to the people we know and that maybe we cohabitate with. But even if we don't cohabitate with anybody, it radiates out from us, and that it is important to get a sort of time capsule going so that people can feel like they have some significance in the future that they may not ever have immediate experience of, but to really like send those ripples forward and get the sense that those ripples are moving forward. So for that reason, and especially given the nature of this podcast, for the reason that you gave these very concrete protocols, if you will, that we've highlighted in the timestamps, of course, as tools, as protocols. I really want to thank you, because oftentimes discussions about past, present, and future can get a bit abstract and a bit vague for people. And you've done us all a great service by making them very concrete and actionable. That's so much of what this podcast is about. It's one part information, one part option for action, right? We don't tell people what to do, but we give them the option for action. I'm certainly going to adopt some of these protocols. And also for taking the time to come to talk with us today, share your wisdom and share what you're doing in many ways. It is not in many ways, it is absolutely part of what you're describing, which is putting your best self toward how things can be better now and in the future. It's also, a great pleasure to sit down with somebody I've known for so many years and learn from you. So it's a real honor and a privilege. And I know everyone else listening to and watching this feels the same way. So thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you for joining me for today's discussion with Ari Wallach. To find links to his book, to his television show, and other resources related to Longpath, please see the show note captions. If you're learning from and or enjoying this podcast, please subscribe to our YouTube channel. That's a terrific zero-cost way to support us. In addition, please subscribe to the podcast on both Spotify and Apple. And on both Spotify and Apple, you can leave us up to a 5-star review. Please check out the sponsors mentioned at the beginning and throughout today's episode. That's the best way to support this podcast. If you have questions for me or comments about the podcast or guests or topics that you'd like me to consider for the Huberman Lab podcast, please put those in the comment section on YouTube. I do read all the comments. For those of you that haven't heard, I have a new book coming out. It's my very first book. It's entitled Protocols, an Operating Manual for the Human Body. This is a book that I've been working on for more than 5 years, and that's based on more than 30 years of research and experience. And it covers protocols for everything from sleep to exercise to stress control, protocols related to focus and motivation. And of course, I provide the scientific substantiation for the protocols that are included. The book is now available by pre-sale at protocolsbook.com. There you can find links to various vendors. You can pick the one that you like best. Again, the book is called Protocols, an Operating Manual for the Human Body. If you're not already following me on social media, I am Huberman Lab on all social media platforms. So that's Instagram, X, formerly known as Twitter, Threads, Facebook, and LinkedIn. And on all those platforms, I discuss science and science-related tools, some of which overlaps with the content of the Huberman Lab podcast, but much of which is distinct from the content on the Huberman Lab podcast. Again, that's Huberman Lab on all social media channels. If you haven't already subscribed to our Neural Network newsletter, our Neural Network newsletter is a zero-cost monthly newsletter that includes podcast summaries as well as protocols in the form of brief 1 to 3 page PDFs. Those protocol PDFs are on things like neuroplasticity and learning, optimizing dopamine, improving your sleep, deliberate cold exposure, deliberate heat exposure. We have a foundational fitness protocol that describes a template routine that includes cardiovascular training and resistance training with sets and reps, all backed by science, and all of which, again, is completely zero cost. To subscribe, simply go to hubermanlab.com, go to the menu tab up in the upper right corner, scroll down to newsletter, and provide your email. And I should emphasize that we do not share your email with anybody. Thank you once again for joining me for today's discussion with Ari Wallach. And last, but certainly not least, thank you for your interest in science.